Hello, my name is Rebecca Chung. I'm the Executive Director of Leadership Programs at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Education and the Director of 21 CSLA Center. Thank you so much for joining this afternoon for our second research webinar that we've launched this fall, featuring scholars from UCLA as well as practitioners from the field. Today, our topic will focus on the following question. Oh, if I could get my mouse to work. We'll focus on the following question. How can we leverage improvement science to build the capacity of leaders and their teams to respond to emerging challenges? Especially in this time of distance learning and pandemic teaching and leading, there's a lot to talk about on this topic, and we'll hear from some leaders from the field today. First, a little bit about 21 CSLA, the sponsor of today's event. I'm sorry, I am having a computer problem. I'm going to try to reshare my screen again, see if that helps. Let's see. Okay, a little bit about 21 CSLA. The 21st Century School Leadership Academy is dedicated to the professional learning and support of California's educational leaders, teacher leaders, site leaders, and district leaders in service of creating more equitable learning environments that ultimately improve equitable learning environments that improve success for underserved students. Headquartered at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Education, it is led in partnership with UCLA School of Education, the California Subject Matter Projects, and the 7 regional academies across the state. 21 CSLA is sponsored by 3 state agencies: the California Department of Education, the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, and the State Board of Education. We thank them for investing in leadership development across our state. Today's agenda is we're going to try a different format from last week as we begin these research webinars. This is a good opportunity for us to test out different formats. We're going to hear from our 2 presenters, Dr. Rahana and Dr. Sagun. Then we're going to have some questions from the field that we fielded in advance about this issue and have a discussion about those. Then we're going to have breakout room time or written reflection time if you prefer. And then finally, we're going to end with some connections to other projects of the state system of support. And so first, we're going to hear from our presenters. And I'd like to introduce them briefly. Dr. Kristen Rahana is faculty in the UCLA Educational Leadership Program and is the Director of Evaluation and Learning for the UCLA Partner School Network. Dr. Rahana is a former Harvard Strategic Data Fellow and served as the Manager for Research and Evaluation at San Jose Unified School District. Her research and practice focus on using evaluation and continuous improvement methods to affect sustainable change in education. Her soon-to-be-released book, Leading Change Through Evaluation, is expected this summer and provides a case study of building improvement science capacity in schools. Dr. Theodore Sagun is the Director of Mathematics Instruction and Learning for the UCLA Partner School Network. He was previously an Associate Director of the UCLA Mathematics Project at UCLA Center X. As a former middle and high school teacher, he is really interested in students' ideas and mathematical thinking. He enjoys working alongside teachers to recognize the wealth of ideas kids bring to the classroom, thereby creating spaces that focus on student assets. And without further ado, I'm going to turn over the screen to our 2 researchers.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. And hopefully everybody can see my screen now. Okay, great. And if you can't see my screen now, hopefully we all can, you might be wondering why I'm showing this picture of a Rubik's Cube. And you might also be wondering what it could possibly have in common with our topic today, or education. So first, let me ask all of you, I know I can't see you, but let me ask all of you, how many of you remember playing with a Rubik's Cube when you were younger. So I'm a Generation Xer, and I'm a child of the 1980s, and I remember playing with one. And I also remember that I could never solve it. As I moved one square, right? Do you remember this? As you moved one square in one direction, for example, if I moved the yellow squares and tried to line up all of those squares, I also ended up moving, let's just say, the blue squares that maybe I already started making progress on. And I started jumbling those up. So with each move I made, I might make progress on the yellow squares, but then I might be losing progress on the blue squares. So with each move I made, all right, let's pick that up. So if you remember playing with the Rubik's Cube, you also remember that as you changed one square in one direction, so for example, that yellow square, if you moved that yellow square and tried to line those up, that you also ended up moving, let's just say, the blue squares. And I remember that as I started to make progress on that one side in the yellow squares, maybe I lost progress on the blue squares. So with every move I made, a new challenge emerged. And the puzzle or the problem was always changing. And that's because essentially the Rubik's Cube is a complex system of interconnected and interdependent parts. So what does that have to do with our topic today? Well, it's those ideas of complexity, interdependence, and really importantly, emergence. So as we all know that in education, we operate in a complex system and new challenges are constantly emerging. So many of us, we struggle with this problem, right? How do we improve a persistent problem related to equity when there's so many interdependent or interconnected parts in one move, one policy, one intervention might result in a change somewhere else in our system. And new challenges are constantly emerging. So our contexts are never static, right? So what worked last year, right, certainly might not work this year. And who knows what next year will bring. So as we kick off our time today, we offer this food for thought. Rather than trying to find that one program, policy, or intervention that will solve a problem, instead consider this. How can we leverage improvement science to build the capacity of leaders and their teams to continually respond to emerging challenges? So here's what you can expect in our time together today. So we structured this presentation around 4 big ideas for leaders to consider regarding continuous improvement, and more specifically, improvement science and equity. So the purpose of today is really just to push our thinking around equity and continuous improvement, rather than for us to provide all the answers or teach you how to do it. So many of you may have experience with continuous improvement or improvement science, and you can start to think how you might apply some of these ideas or what resonates with you. Or maybe you're somebody who's new to improvement science and you just want to get an introduction to it. So hopefully this presentation will serve that for you. So Theo and I will share lessons from our practice and research. Together we coordinate, and Theo actually leads the UCLA Partner School Network, which is an improvement network where math teachers from 5 secondary schools come together and use improvement science to improve their instructional practice. So we're in our 4th year, and we will share lessons from a case study that I conducted in our 1st year, along with lessons from practice that Theo and I are continually learning every year. One more thing I want to say is that there's so much we could say about continuous improvement and equity, but we're keeping our presentation to 30 minutes. And so what that means is that we won't go too deep into some of the ideas that we're going to cover. And there'll be some slides that we share that we really won't provide much detail or go over them, but we wanted to include those slides as references. And we've also included some resources for you at the end. And we would be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. So let's go ahead and jump right in. The first big idea is the idea of establishing a shared understanding of continuous improvement and improvement science. And we're going to spend a little bit more time on this first big idea to give us a foundation. Continuous improvement has been defined as the ongoing improvement of products, services, or processes through incremental and breakthrough improvements. And what is really distinct about continuous improvement is exactly as it sounds. It's continuous, it's ongoing, and continuous improvement is really an umbrella term that encompasses many different approaches. And these approaches can be more or less structured. So for example, a less structured approach might be where you're using ongoing feedback surveys, you're collecting data after every meeting. You're not focusing on a particular problem of practice, rather you're gathering continual feedback. At the other end of the spectrum, You might have a very specific model that has set structures, methods, tools, theoretical underpinnings like improvement science or lesson study, for example. And improvement science is another term that we should come to a common understanding around. It's actually itself is almost an umbrella term because it has many different approaches or models even within improvement science. And you can also see that there are a number of different definitions. And what I've highlighted there on the screen is that improvement science is a field of study or discipline. Essentially, it's the science of improvement. It's grounded in methods, in a theory for improvement, and it's grounded in the idea that you set out to improve some specific problem or practice. And importantly, improvement science is also about understanding and improving systems as well as the problem of practice. And so as we think about complex and persistent problems that we face in education and equity, it's really important to have tools to adjust the systems that perpetuate those inequities. Thus, it's really important, I think, to have a shared understanding when you begin this work around what is continuous improvement and what is improvement science. So continuous improvement doesn't automatically mean that it's attending to systems. It might, and it may or may not use specific improvement methods or theories. It does mean, though, that there's this culture of inquiry and it's just ongoing continuous improvement. Improvement science, on the other hand, is a specific inquiry framework that's problem-centered, systems-oriented, and grounded in improvement theory and methods. However, improvement science isn't always about establishing an ongoing culture of inquiry throughout an organization. It might be, but it's not always about that. So what we like to say is that the sweet spot is really continuous improvement grounded in improvement science. And even though there's so much overlap, you can see that the improvement science is kind of nested within the continuous improvement, even though there's a little bit of a distinction. Even though there's so much overlap, it's really important that you understand what you're grounding your improvement initiatives in. So here's an example of the 6 core principles of improvement from the Carnegie Foundation. So many of you may be familiar with this. This is one of those slides that I won't actually walk through, but we wanted to give you this slide and also point out that these principles are grounded in improvement methods and theories. For those of you that are new to improvement science, I often think about it in 3 broad phases. It's definitely an oversimplification, but I think it's easier to make sense of the process of improvement science when you think about it in these 3 broad phases. So the first phase is really around identifying and understanding the problem that you're trying to improve. Before you can improve a problem, it's really important to understand the causes of it first. So too often in education, we might be quick to jump to solutions without really understanding why we have a problem or the causes of the problem. And this is something that's really understandable because we want to help the students that we have now, but it's not always the most effective way to go about change. This idea of jumping to solutions is a phenomenon that's termed solutionitis. You may have heard that term before. Tony Brake and his colleagues at the Carnegie Foundation came up with that term. And rather than jumping to solutionitis, what we need to first do is understand the root causes and the system within a problem operates before we try to improve it. And so some of the tools that we use are shown there on the screen. And I should also say that these tools aren't exclusive to improvement science. They're inquiry tools that could be used in any framework. And there are more tools even than the ones that I've listed there. You can see system maps, iceberg diagram, the fishbone, 5 whys, process maps, and empathy interviews. All of these tools help you understand the problem. So here's an example. As I mentioned earlier, Theo and I regularly work with teachers using improvement science. And this is an example of one of those tools known as the fishbone diagram. And this tool helps teachers brainstorm potential causes around the problem. And in this example, it helped our teachers brainstorm potential causes around why their students weren't learning math. And what I want to point out here from an equity lens is that the teachers were initially very deficit oriented. So if you kind of zoom in and look at that screen, you'll notice that too. And as hard as that can be to listen to, it's really important to surface these assumptions and mindsets. And this is a brainstorming activity. So we provide that safe space for teachers to get their thoughts out on the table without immediately shutting it down or judging it. Really, it's a safe space. And it's important to surface these assumptions because it really gives us a better understanding of what some of the causes are, right? So it's revealing mindsets that we definitely want to make sure that we're addressing as we go through this process. The second broad phase is developing a theory for improvement. So once you understand some of the causes of the problem, you can start to develop a plan or framework for improving it. Very similar to the idea of a theory of change or theory of action or a logic model, if you're familiar with those tools. The tool we use in improvement science is called a driver diagram. So here's an example of our driver diagram that we're currently using in our network. And I should say that this is a dynamic document that we revisit and update every year. So you'll notice our aim on the left-hand side that is very explicitly focused on equity. Teachers implement equitable practices to actively engage students to meet their variety of learning needs. And if you look at the primary drivers, just to the right of that, you'll also notice that we're addressing some of those deficit assumptions about student learning that the teachers raised in that fishbone diagram. So for example, that first yellow primary driver shows that teachers need to actively engage their students in problem solving rather than placing the idea of engagement on the students. And so how do we do that? Well, you'll see the corresponding secondary drivers, and I won't read them all, but just to give you a couple of examples, we do that by posing engaging activities that promote problem solving and learning. And we do that by using students' mathematical understanding, experiences, culture, and language as resources to support learning of mathematics. And I should also say that this driver diagram is grounded in research. We use principles to action from NCTM to initially develop this driver diagram. The third broad phase is putting these ideas into action by rapidly testing strategies and generating new knowledge. The tool we use for this is the Plan, Do, Study Act cycle, or the PDSA cycle, which is a cycle of inquiry where you plan to try some new strategy that is developed following the driver diagram. You implement it, and then you collect data that will help you learn from the cycle and then determine what you'll do next. So it's often an iterative cycle where you continue tweaking the strategy until you get the results that you want. We won't spend time on this slide, but we wanted to give it to you as an example of a PDSA cycle in our network. So the teachers complete this form as part of the PDSA cycle. And I should also say that in our network, we really encourage fast PDSA cycles. So our teachers complete their cycles within a week. Sometimes they complete them within a day. And the way we view it is that PDSA cycles are really learning cycles. So the faster the cycle, the faster the learning. And then lastly, wrapped around these three phases is the idea of systems thinking, which brings us to the big idea number 2. So when it comes to systems thinking, you want to be inclusive of multiple perspectives and experiences. So David Peter Stroh, who is an author of a really great book called Systems Thinking for Social Change, uses the parable of the blind man and the elephant to explain systems thinking. So you might be familiar with this parable, but if you're not, in the parable, there are 6 blind men who live in a remote village, and they had only heard about elephants and were extremely curious about this great beast that they kept hearing about. And one day, an elephant came to their village, and they were so excited, they decided to seek it out and learn more about it. So the first man went up to the elephant and touched the side of the elephant and exclaimed, "It feels like a wall." The second man touched the tusk and said, "It's strong and it's smooth." The third man, who touched the trunk, said, No, it's like a snake." And the fourth man went up to it and touched the legs and declared, No, you're all wrong, it's like a tree." The fifth man touched the elephant's ears and said, "It's flat, it's like a fan." And then lastly, the sixth man felt the elephant's tails and noted, No, it's like a rope." And so they started arguing with each other, and they really couldn't understand why they had such different perceptions. And they began arguing with each other really loudly over who was correct. And a wise man who was passing by on the road heard them arguing, and he stopped, and he told them that they were all correct. And the men were shocked. and just couldn't understand how that was even possible. And the wise men said to them, well, you each touched a different part of the elephant, and the whole elephant consisted of all those different traits. So like the six blind men, many of us only see our part of our system or our part of a problem of practice. We see it from our own perspective. And we tend to see the part that's right in front of us and may sometimes struggle with another perspective because it doesn't represent our own. And systems thinking is a way to help us see the whole elephant or the whole system. So I won't go into systems thinking too much, but I wanted to share three essential concepts. And the first is the one that the parable really highlights. And that is the importance of multiple perspectives, that people can have different views about the same system and problem, and that we really need to include a diversity of experiences, language, race, ethnicities, gender, positions, even including student voices, maybe parent voices, to really help us understand a problem or a system. And we really need to consider, are there certain perspectives that are being privileged over others? The second concept is this idea of interrelationships. And this is what we most commonly think about when we refer to systems, right? This interconnection or interdependence among kind of system elements or parts, and that a change in one can affect another part. So kind of the parts of a whole. The last concept is a really important concept too. And this is the idea of system boundaries, bounding our system within which we work. So if you do some of the systems work, you might know it's really overwhelming to think about how can you change a whole system? And really, can one team really go about changing a whole system? So rather than thinking about a whole system, are there subsystems within it that we can bound and work within? So when we work with teachers, we encourage them to bound the system to their classroom. That's a system, it's a subsystem. When we work with administrators, we encourage them to bound the system to their school. That's a system. All the while, though, they still need to know it's operating within a larger system, being aware of that. But bounding the system can be much more empowering when it gives you the feeling that's within your locus of control. You can make changes in a bounded system. One other thing I want to point out about this concept of boundaries is that it doesn't only refer to time and space, but it also refers to which stakeholders you're including when you understand the system. Are you bounding it in a way that you're leaving people out? Are you leaving out parents, for example? So that's another piece to think about when you think about bounding your system. Again, that same idea, are you privileging certain perspectives or are you marginalizing certain voices? The third big idea is this idea of eliciting and collecting asset-based student data for your PDSA cycle. And this, I asked Theo to join me for the presentation today because this is a real shift in my own thinking around PDSAs and data. And he's the one really responsible for getting me to think about data differently. And the result has been really powerful for our work with teachers. So I'm going to turn it over to Theo, and he's going to share some of his thoughts.
So good afternoon, everyone. And before I share anything with regards to this content, just for a little bit of framing, I just want to emphasize that in our work, in our collaborations, my focus has essentially been on what happens in the classroom with instruction. So in saying all of that, I get to represent all of the awesome and thoughtful and innovative colleagues that I have, and especially all of their wonderful students' mathematical thinking. But as we've kind of alluded to, we worked alongside our teacher colleagues to elicit asset-based student data that were recorded through PDSA forms. So for the PDSA, we explicitly invited our colleagues to collect asset-based data as a way of providing evidence of what students can do. So here, the thinking around this was for teachers to be able to recognize the mathematical ideas that kids come with, which in our work, especially in the beginning stages of our network and our collaboration with teachers, was a little divergent from perhaps a lot of the classrooms that we entered, a lot of these spaces that perhaps default to looking for gaps or just this general idea of like, what is it that students don't know? So for us, from maybe a more cognitive or a knowledge-based standpoint, we worked alongside our colleagues to consider how is it that you can make sense of what your students know, what they're bringing to the classroom. How can you build on or extend that mathematical thinking? But one of the other things that we really want to emphasize in this work is this was also intentional, this idea of surfacing students' thinking, because by focusing on that from an equity perspective, we were also encouraging our teachers to look for and recognize the assets that their kids come in with. And some of that we've kind of alluded to, and that could be the primary language that kids come with, their experiences, the assets of the community, or their culture. And so the implicit overarching goal there was to humanize the math classroom. So what we're gonna share here is this goes all the way back to the infancy of our network and our collaborations. This was an example of a reasoning activity that teachers engaged with. So this which one doesn't belong or one of these things activity was really helpful in supporting teachers to recognize that their kids have a lot of math ideas that might not necessarily typically surface or come up in a classroom that was primarily focused on lecture. So over time, we encouraged our teachers to collect artifacts, or what we typically think of as the data around their students' mathematical thinking. So these are examples from the one of these things or which one doesn't belong activity that we saw in the previous. So here, teachers had epiphanies like, oh, my quiet kids actually know a lot when I slow down and give them opportunities to share their ideas. Other things that we've heard were my English learners can actually problem solve and I don't need to necessarily have to show them how to solve problems. And then over the course of our collaborations and our interaction, teachers were able to collect data that challenged maybe their preconceived ideas about what students know and can do.
All right, thank you, Theo. So lastly, I wanted to point out, building upon what Theo was saying, I want to point out this reflection. And this is a reflection that was in the PDSA form. So after they did the PDSA, and this is a teacher from the school whose fishbone diagram that I showed you at the beginning. And this teacher did a PDSA cycle around the which one doesn't belong activity that Theo just showed you. And he collected data using poster paper in the way that Theo just showed you. And this reflection was after he did the PDSA. And I'll give you a moment to read it. And this is why asset-based data in your PDSA cycle is so powerful, because it can be used to challenge deficit-based assumptions. So these teachers that initially did that fishbone diagram, they were saying, well, my students just aren't interested in math. They're not interested, they don't want to learn it. But now, going through this cycle, teachers actually have evidence that says, wait a minute, my students are actually interested in math when I change my teaching practices. And so this is a type of learning that we really need to think about occurring in our own improvement teams, not just this kind of instrumental or incremental learning that's kind of improving a practice or tweaking a practice or correcting a practice. What we actually want to do is we want to create learning that causes us to rethink and reconsider how and why we're doing certain things in certain ways. So in order to be transformational when it comes to equity, we may need to actually change our underlying beliefs and assumptions around how students learn, and also maybe around who is capable of learning. So we need to push more deeply on these kind of underlying beliefs and assumptions. The last big idea that I want to offer to you is that we need to be intentional about building improvement science capacity. So this is really what my own research focuses on, how to build capacity for teachers and administrators to engage in improvement science. And the reason being is that, I mean, I'll be the first to admit it's not an easy process. Improvement science can feel very technical. It takes a bit of commitment. And so often we're asking teachers and administrators to do this on top of everything else that we're doing. And if we're really being real, it can be challenging to really implement. And so my own research studied our network in its first year and how we were able to build that capacity. And at the beginning of that first year, we conducted a survey. And we conducted a survey of 23 participants, teachers and administrators, and we asked them about their familiarity with improvement science concepts. And 39%, or about 4 out of 10, said that they were familiar with or very familiar with improvement science and PDSAs. And so the flip side of that is about 60% were not familiar with it. However, what is really interesting here is that only about 2 out of 10 said that they were familiar with driver diagrams, suggesting that for some teachers and administrators who may have thought they were familiar with improvement science didn't actually know as much about it as they thought. So we knew this going into our work that we needed to be very intentional about building the capacity, both individually and organizationally at the school level. And the findings from my research suggested a number of important factors. I'm going to share 2 for building this capacity. And the first one I'm going to share is this idea of learning in context. So after we dug into the problem, we studied the problem, and we created the driver diagram, we began to develop 2 visions around our work. So one was the content-related vision. So we had a vision for what quality math instruction looked like for students. That vision is what we've laid out in the driver diagram that we initially showed you. And we also provided math instructional professional development around that. We also had another vision around building the capacity in improvement science. And so we also provided professional development around improvement science, but what's really important here is that we wrap that in the math professional development. So Theo just showed you a moment ago how he taught the teachers to engage in the which one doesn't belong math activity, and how we modeled how to collect data for the PDSA using this activity, and really how to do the PDSA. That's the activity that we use. And this worked really well because teachers were able to make sense of the PDSA process through a specific concrete practice. So essentially, they're making sense of improvement science through the context of math instruction. And so this taps into this idea of situated cognition learning theory, or essentially learning in context. And so furthermore, like what we found that year and what we still find today is that teachers really aren't that interested in learning improvement science just for the sake of learning improvement science. They're actually really interested in learning how to get better at teaching math. That's what they're interested in. So if you wrap the 2 visions together, you can help to build that capacity. The second finding is connected to what I call the irony of improvement science implementation in schools. So many of you have probably seen this quote before, right? It's a pretty well-known quote or some type of similar quote. Every system is perfectly designed to deliver the result it produces. So this is a very well-known quote in improvement science. And so here's what I think is the irony in all of this, is that all too often in education, at least in my own experience, we might hold a workshop, a meeting, some type of professional development where we teach improvement science to educators, or we teach some other type of continuous improvement process. And we hope that we've inspired them. We hope that we've taught them those tools. And then when we release them back to their sites and hope that they can find the time to engage in these activities on top of everything else they're doing, without really ensuring that they have the structures and systems, or maybe the time and the space set up for them to consistently focus on improvement science activities. So in my own study, I found that a school's ability to actually implement improvement science, and more specifically the PDSA cycles, was related to their ability to set up these structures. So we found that the most important role of the site leader in this process was really to carve out the time and space for the teachers to meet, rather than leaving it up for the teachers to try to find the time on their own for them to meet. And it quickly became apparent that when the principal didn't carve out the space, that it was really difficult for teachers to find this time to come together. And essentially that impacted their ability to complete PDSA cycles. So the teachers whose principals were carving out that space were finishing and completing PDSA cycles more than teachers at the other schools. And so I should also say that we as a network team also went in those first couple of years and worked with the teachers at their schools to facilitate these meetings. And this was really important because even after that first year, many teachers said that they were comfortable engaging in improvement science activities. They felt confident that they could apply it, but they didn't really feel that confident or comfortable that they could facilitate these activities with other teachers. You know, our teachers said to us, you know, I don't know it well enough to actually teach somebody else, or if they did feel like they knew it well enough, they really didn't feel like they had the time to be intentional about setting up these meetings and facilitating. So for those leading the work, we encourage you to consider this. How will you create the systems and structures and supports for your teams to consistently engage in improvement activities? And lastly, we leave you with this slide. So we're out of time, and this is another one of those slides that we weren't planning to walk through, but hopefully you have a copy of the slides, the PDF slides in the chat. And this will be a slide that you can take with you. But these are some final questions for you to consider as you think about how to leverage improvement science and systems thinking to address equity issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our speakers and our researchers from UCLA. We invited a few leaders from the field to provide some current challenges that they're having and questions that they have about improvement science. And so I'm going to reshare my screen in the hope I share their perspectives with you. And we're going to put their questions in conversation with our researchers so that they can respond. So Dr. Letitia Davis is our first leader. Her school is Baldwin Hills Elementary School in Los Angeles Unified School District. And she wants to know, from your perspective, how might improvement science help us figure out whom distance learning is working for? Like, there are children who are thriving during distance learning. How can improvement science be used to identify those students? Any quick thoughts about that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to, I'll start and then Theo, please feel free to jump in. You know, everything for me always goes back to really just kind of understanding the problem first. You know, what data helps you understand, is there what the problems and the challenges are around distance learning and who it might be working for and who it might not be working for. And again, coming at it from that perspective of there are multiple perspectives and experiences, and who will you include in those initial conversations to help you understand this problem? So Theo, I know you wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to really highlight something that's been surfacing a lot within recent date. This idea of collaboration. I think our colleagues have just been reminding us that um, they've been given opportunities to share ideas and to collaborate across the network with folks from across schools. So for our work, this just gives us a space to develop a focus on the things that are going to be helpful for our teachers, our colleagues. So that for us boils down to developing a lens for, again, the things that I mentioned earlier, what students know and can do. Um, at the same time, it's also an opportunity to collaborate around developing a focus on what we do well as teachers. So it helps us to maybe develop this natural framework that continues to surface students' thinking, their mathematical ideas, but at the same time, from a pedagogical perspective, what is it that we're doing well as teachers that support kids to surface their ideas or their mathematical reasoning, or to have students engage with each other's ideas. So this idea of collaboration um, around what kids know and are able to do, we try to emphasize that as being really, really productive, especially in this time of remote learning, because we know that's going to translate really, really well when we return to physical classrooms.
Great. And if I can just summarize what you said and tie it into a leadership move, what I hear is that you would encourage Dr. Davis to seek out students for whom distance learning has been a supportive learning environment, and then ask them about their learning experiences to better understand why the distance format has been helpful to them, and then look across multiple students who are in that scenario to determine if there's something that can be improved for schooling in the future. Thank you, Dr. Davis, for your question. We're going to move to the second question, which is from Edward Velez, who is the principal of John F. Kennedy High School in Fremont Unified School District. His question is about how systems of continuous improvement can be best utilized to reach and support students who are not engaging, either by choice or by hardship during distance learning. How can support or intervention be supported in this time of through continuous improvement while we're in distance learning and teaching mode?
So I feel like I'm going to be a little repetitive. And going back to that first phase, right? Understanding this problem. And I think this is so important because it is right. There's term solutionitis. We don't want to just make assumptions or assume that we know what the solution or that we know the causes of the problems. So I think it's really important to engage in that collective inquiry with teachers, parents, maybe students, to really understand first, what are the challenges with engaging? Because we all know enough now to know that there are a number of challenges that teachers and students are facing when it comes to trying to engage teachers into this distant learning. So,
and if I can extend
I
what
think,
you were just, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Please. No, please.
So you talked about asset-based questioning, and I think that this question that Principal Velez presents poses a really good challenge in terms of thinking about it from an asset-based perspective. And so what do you think about my off-the-cuff ideas around asset-based questioning in this scenario? For example, what would it look like for this principal to think of to look at attendance patterns of those who quote unquote don't have good attendance and go into the spaces that they choose to go to and look for what drives them to choose to come to school, and then think about how that could be applied in the environments that they have not chosen to participate in. What do you think about that as an asset-based strategy for Principal Velez?
I was actually going to comment that the way that I was thinking about this was perhaps to look at the classrooms where there's a lot of student engagement and a lot of student discourse and a lot of in my world, math world, a lot of problem solving that's happening, right? To be able to investigate what it is that those teachers are doing to cultivate a classroom environment that is inviting to their kids, that seeks to surface what it is that kids know and gives them the space to be able to share a bit about themselves in the midst of everything that we're encountering right now.
Great. Right, we have two more leaders.
Yeah, I agree.
Mhm.
Oh, I was gonna say, I agree. And what it makes me think about is when you think about this type of inquiry and understanding the problem is exactly that too, understanding where the assets are and what's working too. And you're thinking about those bright spots or the idea of positive deviance. What's working well and what can we learn from that too, as we start to develop a framework that maybe we can apply to others.
Thank you. We have a third principal who has a question, which is, who is Megan Greger. She's the principal of West High School in Kern High School District in Bakersfield. And I believe she's with us today. Welcome and thank you for your question. And the question is about how school leadership teams engage in data collection for continuous improvement. You started on this question, I believe, in your presentation. Public K-12 schools currently do this yearly in the school plans for student achievement on a large school-wide scale. But how should schools focus on continuous improvement around inequalities on a regular basis that still allows for implementation and change?
Yeah, so this is a thing that I always push on, is this idea of doing the PDSA cycles. And I know in education, many of us started doing these longer PDSA cycles because we often thought of more traditional data. Do we align it with an assessment cycle or grades or some other type of data collection cycle around achievement? And what happens is sometimes you might do a cycle once a quarter, once a semester, or it sounds like in some cases even in once a year. But PDSA cycles were really designed to do quickly because they're learning cycles. So if you do a cycle once a year or once a quarter or once a semester, what you're actually doing is you're going through a learning cycle. You're really slowing down the learning. So doing the cycles more quickly, I think will speed up the learning. And as Theo, shared around the data, thinking a little bit differently about data. What's the data that will help you learn quickly? So for us, it was those artifacts. It could be kind of more qualitative data. It could be a rubric, whatever that might be. But it's really about finding data that will help you learn and help you learn quickly. And as I said already, like I love the asset-based data because it really challenged teachers' assumptions and provided evidence around what their students could do. Their students were quite capable and were interested in learning.
We have one final leader who submitted a question for our discussion, who is Salvador Herrera. He is the principal of a continuation high school, specifically Robertson Continuation High School and Vista Alternative School, also in Fremont Unified School District. And he's interested in understanding how continuous improvement applies to the alternative education setting, where establishing authentic relationships with students might be even more essential to academic success. What are some ways to develop authentic relationships in a virtual environment within an improvement science framework? And I believe this is in authentic relationships with students, potentially, that Principal Herrera is interested in.
Yeah, so I suppose I'll go this time. I'm thinking about all of the awesome things that our colleagues have done, and I think I get to give them a shout out in thinking about this. This idea of authentic relationships, I think, can be harbored depending on the lens that you use, because of the emphasis of what students know and what their experiences are. In our context with our teachers, the teachers' work that we collaborate with give their students plenty of spaces to basically just share a little bit about themselves. It actually happened in the two remote classes that I was in earlier today. So for us, from maybe a social emotional learning perspective, I think that's just given the teachers opportunities to maybe determine how kids are doing or which kids might connect with, but maybe even equally as important, from a content perspective, it's given the teachers opportunities to adjust their lessons to connect the math to the things that are relevant to kids or the things that are actually that the kids find interesting. So overall, I think it's just given us opportunities, especially for the kids, to be able to see that their teachers are actually listening to them and being responsive.
I also wonder about how students in continuation high school might be engaged in their own version of continuous improvement and improvement science, especially in this climate where we're in very uncharted territory. Perhaps another strategy that Principal Herrera could consider is engaging his students in continuous improvement practices to inform his school. And so with this, I want to thank these four leaders for their questions. And I want to move to a time for you to spend some time reflecting on what you've heard so far. You have two options today for doing this for the next 15 minutes. We have assigned you to a randomized breakout room, and momentarily you'll have a chance to accept that invitation if you're interested in an oral discussion. If you prefer to have a quiet writing period, which we understand many of you may not get much of in your daily work life, and you might appreciate having a few minutes of quiet to write some ideas, feel free to decline the invitation and stay in the main reading room, and we will play some instrumental music for you to support your writing. And then we'll finish today's webinar with a final guest who will talk about and share some of her equity initiatives through the state system of support and how they connect to continuous improvement. We're moving to breakout rooms now, and we'll let everyone make you enjoyed your I hope you enjoyed your breakout room discussions or your quiet writing time. It's my pleasure to introduce our final guest for today's research webinar, Dr. Fabiola Bagula, who is a thought provoker and change catalyst, a leader in the development and implementation of change initiatives within large educational settings, including programs and people. Her expertise in dialogue and conflict resolution enables her to successfully lead in diverse, challenging environments. She's consistently gains and maintains the trust of those she engages and specializes in topics of educational and systemic equity, dialogue facilitation, authenticity, improvement science, and adaptive leadership. Dr. Bagula holds a PhD in leadership studies from the University of San Diego. Her dissertation work was on Latina leadership and identity formation, and she is the senior director of the equity department for the San Diego County Office of Education and works with educational leaders across San Diego County. Thank you so much for joining us today. And also as a representative for San Diego County of Office of Education, I know an important representative of the state system of support here in California. And so for this next portion, we're going to have a dialogue about some of your work, some of the work of San Diego County. I know that your work involves two aspects. One is about developing equity consciousness, and the other is about using continuous improvement to address issues of systemic equity. Could you share an example of each from the work of your program? And thank you for being with us.
And thank you for that invitation. I appreciate it. So some of the ways that we're approaching this work is really thinking about the three aspects that are necessary to do this work. Now, we've been calling it equity consciousness, but really what's within that equity consciousness is really both identity and mindset. What I mean when I say identity is we pose the question of what do I understand about my own identity and situatedness and how students may experience me. That matters. So our identity matters when we're in classroom. Our mindset also matters. What's my own mindset and assumptions about a student's ability to succeed? So those two things are what develops equity consciousness. And then at the same time, we also want to make sure that we go into the skill set or this continuous improvement piece, which is, so what skills do I have and which do I need to learn in order to meet the various needs of the students? In my opinion, the skill set piece, the one that encompasses the continuous improvement model, is actually one of the hardest ones. Because when I think about the skill set necessary to do equity work, I think very strong tier 1 instruction, an easiness of assessment literacy, and then also many different points of entry for students in designing differentiated instruction. So really what we do is we talk about identity, mindset, and skill set as equity consciousness and continuous improvement. But when I talk to teachers, I say it's your head, your heart, and your hand. And we're really trying to develop all three at the same time. What we're thinking, what we're feeling and believing, and then also what we can do immediately different. And so when we engage in that sort of professional learning, we also start to think about what might be some of the ways that we need to change our instruction, what might be some of the ways that we need to think about our school system as a system much larger than just myself and my role, so as an equity team. And that's when they start to design PDSA cycles around change ideas and when improvement science comes into play. But we really believe that we need to think about and explore identity and mindset at the same time. It can't be done differently.
I appreciate your connections to the presentation from the researchers, specifically related to how evidence connects to mindsets and changes. It's a reciprocal process. And I'd love to invite our two speakers to add additional thoughts about how equity is essential to the work of improvement science.
Yeah, I think that completely resonates with hopefully the message that we've been putting out, that it's through this process, and this is a collective inquiry process, and it's through this process you're creating first these adult spaces, these equitable and inclusive adult spaces where you get to understand a system or a problem of practice from multiple perspectives. And it's through that process that you get to, surface some of those mindsets too, in a very, like I mentioned earlier when I showed that fishbone diagram, in a way that's not judgmental. It's important to surface these assumptions, and we want to brainstorm, and we want to create that space so that we can start to, kind of change those through the work that we're doing. And I think, as I've said several times now, I think, that's so valuable about this idea of, this asset-based student data. That's the data that we found really challenges those mindsets because they provide evidence that students are capable of doing things that maybe teachers didn't think they were before. We provide spaces for, Theo can speak more to this, where sometimes teachers go in and they do what we also do these learning labs, which are like these collaborative type PDSAs, and they get to go in and they get to see other students. And sometimes they learn from other students and they're learning what their, other students are capable of doing things that they hadn't thought of. So it's really creating these spaces where you can provide that evidence of, that challenges the way that maybe you thought students learned, and also might challenge, what you thought students were capable of. So Theo, with that, I'll turn it over to you if you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I think implicitly over time, we've essentially created a situation where we were thinking really creatively about how to support teachers to be generative. And part of that focused on collecting data around students' mathematical thinking. So going into the classrooms and collecting artifacts around student work, charts of their work and things of that nature. At the same time, it also brought us to a space of how is it that we can maybe turn this idea of professional development on its head and maybe take that into the classroom. So we've essentially engaged with what Kristen brought up, this idea of math learning labs, where teachers plan lessons together. Teachers also rehearse these lessons, but at the same time, we created PDSAs that with the overarching aim of figuring out what is it that students know and how is it that we can surface that. So over time, teachers' mindsets changed because they started to recognize that their kids actually know a lot more content that we typically give them credit for. And then over time, because we kept on doing this, I think it just provided the opportunity for teachers to continue to keep that hunger and to continue to seek data that might surprise them or might get them really, really excited around what students know and can do.
If I can connect a question that came up in the chat with our discussion, let's take it a step further. We heard from a principal who talked about annual cycles of learning. We also heard about longer cycles of learning. And then we heard our researchers talk about shorter cycles of learning in order to really be able to change practice in real time. Let's talk about how that connects with asset-based learning. What are the constraints of staying within mandated protocols, and what are some of the quick data ideas that you have for informing cycles on a faster cycles, and also increasing that asset lens that we all know is needed in our everyday work? Any examples there?
Yeah, I'm actually wondering if I could go back to that example of a PDSA form that I showed. Would that be helpful if I shared my screen on that, or I could either just refer to that? That it's in the PDF slides, but there's that PDSA cycle form in it. And what teachers were doing for that first practice, the very first cycle they did was that which one doesn't belong. It's a task that they learn, that teachers are trying out. So you can try it out in one class, you can try it out in all your classes in one day, you can try it out really, really quickly. And it was connected to our driver diagram where they wanted to engage students in problem solving that promoted conceptual understanding. So it's very explicitly hooked into that driver diagram, and why we believe that will change practice and create more equitable learning spaces that will meet our students' learning needs. And Theo showed how, and this is actually what we did in our session as a network, he showed how you could collect data, and he actually took them through a which one doesn't belong activity, these teachers as students. And he showed, so that poster paper, you're facilitating this activity and you're actually writing down, well, students' answers. You're writing down who said what, who said something, and what they actually said. So you're writing down what the students are thinking and what they know, and you're providing this space for them to actually build upon each other's ideas as well. So that's data. That poster paper, who said what, that's data. And so we encourage data like that you can collect really quickly and actually informs how did that task go for you? And if you go to that slide, I actually won't show, but if you go to the slide in the PDF slides where there's that green reflection box, or even that thought bubble, that's what they learned from that cycle. They might have learned, okay, it didn't work as much as well as I wanted to, it didn't get the participation. So next time, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to do this. I'm going to build upon it. I'm going to try it this way. And then they tried it again. Or maybe it worked well, and then they thought, okay, well, I'm going to start implementing it this way. So those are really quick cycles that really elicit what students know. And not only are they helping to improve that tool, but they're actually shifting mindsets as well.
I have an example that I can also provide. We were working with a middle school that really wanted to determine their needs, their supports for the English learners, their LTELs, especially in middle school. And they were designing a master schedule to provide them support. But what they noticed is that the students' engagement was very low. So we went in there to conduct empathy interviews to figure out, like, the level of engagement. And one of the things that we found, or the change idea that the group landed on, was what if we honor the language brokering that these children have to do between English and their native tongue. And so one of the things that they started to do is they started to ask the students, so in what spaces are you translating for your communities? And then as we designed that, as we took down that data, it very much aligned with all the language brokering research that was done, where they're translating in medical offices, with landlords, in really high stakes places. And then they started doing more of a social advocacy language course instead of a remedial English. The level of participation, of course, went up. The students were very much engaged. And one of my favorite things, and I know I'm in San Diego, I'm not up there where you are, but our gas and electric company had sent a very legalese sort of letter, and all the students brought that letter in and said, so we don't know what this means, and we're supposed to select something, and it might cost my mom money and she's going to be mad. So how do I translate this? And so just the level of relevancy that came through, just based on that little bit of change idea and the collection of, like, where do we translate and how might we change this course, really kind of added to the engagement and the level of language that students were participating and initiating in.
Wonderful. So believe it or not, we've almost come to an hour and a half already. And so we want to end with a few final thoughts. What advice do you have for our participants today who are in the process or embarking on or sustaining or trying to create a culture of continuous improvement and in their context? What words of advice do you have for them? And we'll each just take a turn with a few final words of wisdom for the group. Is there someone who'd like to go first?
I think mine would be, oh, I'm sorry. Go for it. Sorry.
I have like a gut feeling to answer this, and then I'm like now questioning myself. So that's why I was like, just say it. If it's your gut feeling, just say it.
That's right.
I actually think it's modeling. I think that leaders, or even to the question that was posed about district leaders, is they want a continuous improvement model, or they want to have that kind of space, but they're not doing it themselves. And so if they model a continuous improvement, and this is the way that we're going to be, this is how we behave, the process matters, I think that goes a long way. Sorry, Theo.
Oh, no problem. I actually had a gut reaction as well. So I think for me, similarly, to build on that idea of modeling, I'm naturally really, really interested in what kids bring to the classroom context. And then for me, so one of my natural defaults is, how is it I can continue to surface that so that my colleagues can see all of the brilliant ideas that their kids have, regardless of how connected it is to math. And I know that over time, it really does shape the way that they view their kids.
Kristen, do you have something you'd like to share?
I do. I mean, I think the modeling is so important, and it just makes me think more about just providing these collaborative inquiry spaces. And what we find in our own work is that teachers love to collaborate. I mean, that's what they love the most about this. So even though you think you don't want to put anything else on them, and right now, we definitely are facing challenges. But in a normal year, teachers might be really willing to volunteer. People like to be asked what they think about something. So creating these inclusive spaces where teachers get to collaborate side by side with administrators, and also thinking about the power dynamics in that too. How might you facilitate things, these type of spaces, so that you can engage with it? And then of course, as I said at the end of my presentation, being really intentional about how you create this capacity, just both individually and then as an organization.
And if I could just add a few more words, I would just advise developing a culture of learning in your organization and as a person. So be open to being surprised yourself and encourage and embrace this idea of surprise with your team. Because the more you're open to surprise, I suspect the more surprises you'll find. And if we can keep this inquiry mindset and embrace the surprise, then we can use that as inspiration to do further investigation, to understand more, to better understand the multiple perspectives in our schools that inform our work. Well, with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for today. I'd also like to thank all of the leaders who took the time to submit their questions for our discussion. Our panelists also have a resource that they have provided for you. If you're interested in more of the how of improvement science, they recommend this book as a good starting place. It's like a handbook so that it could help you with developing the practices. Finally, we also want to note that we're seeking your feedback. We hope that you'll give us feedback about today's research webinar as we design more projects in the future. And we also want to just let you know that on our website, we will provide more details and more announcements about future webinars in 2021. And with that, thank you for your feedback. Thank you for your time today. And we wish you a smooth ending to a very tumultuous year of 2020. Good night.